It was supposed to be the perfect night, the winter gala, 7 months pregnant, in front of everyone I knew. I saw him, my husband, his hand on another woman, laughing, wearing my mother's necklace, the one I thought was safe. And in that moment, everything I believed about my life, about my marriage, shattered. By the end of tonight, I would learn the truth. Betrayal isn't always what it seems. And sometimes the people you trust most are the ones plotting your downfall. Stay until the end. This story changes everything you think you know about love, trust, and revenge. If you love stories full of twists and real emotions, hit like, drop a comment, share this with a friend who needs a shock, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. The crystal chandelier above the Manhattan Winter Gala Ballroom cast diamond-shaped shadows across Grace Morrison's swollen face. 7 months pregnant, she stood near the silent auction tables, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other cradling her belly through the too-tight emerald gown. Her feet screamed in designer heels that no longer fit her swollen ankles. Across the glittering ballroom, Grace watched her husband. David Morrison, 38 years old and Manhattan's rising tech darling, had his hand on another woman's lower back, not hovering politely, not guiding her through the crowd. His fingers were spread wide, possessive, intimate. The woman was Sophie Brennan, David's executive vice president of strategy, 28 years old, brilliant smile, confident posture, everything Grace used to be before she gave up her curator position at the Guggenheim 5 years ago, before marriage, before pregnancy, before she became invisible. But it was the necklace that made Grace's vision blur. Her mother's necklace, antique rose-cut diamonds set in platinum, circa 1940. The only thing Grace had left of her mother, who died when Grace was 16. David had taken it to the jeweler 6 months ago for cleaning. It never came back. Now it sparkled against Sophie Brennan's throat. Grace's heart hammered. The room tilted. She reached for the auction table to steady herself, but her hand found only air. Her knees buckled, and the marble floor rushed up to meet her. The impact drove the air from her lungs. Pain exploded through her hip, her shoulder. Gasps erupted around her. Footsteps thundered. Grace's hand flew to her belly, terror flooding through her. The baby. Please, God, let the baby be okay. Through the ringing in her ears, Grace heard it. High, delighted female laughter. Sophie's voice carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. Oh my God, she's so dramatic, always making everything about her. Other guests laughed, nervous, awkward titters that rippled through the crowd. Grace's cheek pressed against cold marble, and she realized something worse than physical pain. Everyone knew. Everyone had been watching David's affair unfold for months, and they thought it was funny. David appeared above her, crouching down, but his eyes went to Sophie first, checking if she was okay, if she was embarrassed. Only then did he look at his pregnant wife lying on the floor. Grace, he said quietly, his voice tight with annoyance. What are you doing? What was she doing? She was collapsing. She was bleeding. She was losing everything. An EMT pushed through the crowd, a young woman with kind eyes. Ma'am, don't move. We're going to check you out. I'm fine, Grace whispered. But she wasn't fine. Her vision swam. Her hip throbbed. The baby hadn't moved since she fell. Did you hit your head? The EMT's hands were gentle, professional. I don't know. I don't think so. David stood up, straightening his tuxedo jacket. To the surrounding guests, his voice was apologetic, embarrassed. She's been having dizzy spells. The pregnancy. I've been worried about her coming tonight. Lies. Grace had never had dizzy spells. She had been fine until she saw her dead mother's necklace around another woman's throat. Sophie moved closer, stage whispering to a cluster of society wives. This is the third time this month. Poor David's been dealing with so much. The third time, Grace had never collapsed before in her life. But Sophie was building a narrative brick by brick that Grace was unstable, dramatic, difficult. The EMTs brought a stretcher. As they lifted Grace onto it, she caught Sophie's eye across the ballroom. Sophie raised her champagne glass in a small private toast. A smile played at her lips. Not friendly, not sympathetic, victorious. Grace's hand closed around her belly, and she felt it. Finally, A small flutter, the baby moving, alive. Relief flooded through her so intensely she started crying. "It's okay," the EMT said softly. "You're going to be fine. We're taking you to the hospital now." But Grace knew better. Nothing was going to be fine. Not anymore. Maybe it never had been. As the EMTs wheeled her through the ballroom, Grace saw them all watching. The investors David courted. The society wives Grace had hosted at dinner parties. The art world colleagues who used to respect her. Every single one of them knew David was having an affair. Every single one had watched Sophie wear stolen jewelry and said nothing. Grace had been living in a glass house, and everyone could see inside except her. The ambulance doors closed on the glittering ballroom, on the laughing guests, on David standing next to Sophie. Grace closed her eyes and let the tears come. The emergency room lights were too bright, too white. Grace lay on a narrow bed, sensors attached to her belly monitoring the baby's heartbeat. The steady beep, beep, beep was the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. Dr. Martinez, a woman in her 50s with gray streaks in her dark hair, reviewed Grace's chart with a deepening frown. "Your blood pressure is 160/100. That's dangerously high, especially at 7 months pregnant. Is the baby okay?" Grace's voice came out hoarse. "The baby's heartbeat is strong, but we're looking at signs of preeclampsia. This is serious, Grace. Your blood pressure suggests chronic stress. How long have you been feeling this way?" Grace opened her mouth to answer, but the curtains swung open and David walked in. 3 hours. He'd taken 3 hours to come to the hospital. Grace had labored through examinations, blood draws, and ultrasounds alone, while her husband did what? Finished networking? Reassured Sophie she was more important? "Doctor, thank you for taking care of my wife." David's voice was warm, concerned, the perfect worried husband. He even managed to look rumpled, like he'd rushed here. "How is she?" "Your wife has dangerously high blood pressure. I was just asking about stress levels at home." David sighed, a sound full of weary patience. "Grace has been emotional lately. The pregnancy hormones. Sometimes she imagines things, gets worked up over nothing." Grace stared at him. "I'm not imagining things. Sophie was wearing my mother's necklace, the one you took to the jeweler 6 months ago." David's expression shifted to gentle concern, but his eyes were cold. "Grace, honey, there's no necklace. Sophie bought her own jewelry. You're confused." "I'm not confused. I know my mother's necklace. I know every diamond, every setting. See, doctor?" David turned to Dr. Martinez, his voice dropping to confidential. "This is what I'm dealing with. She's been having these episodes, making accusations. I'm worried about her mental state." Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable, her gaze shifting between Grace crying in the hospital bed and David standing calm and rational in his tuxedo. Grace felt something crack inside her chest. He was gaslighting her. Right here, in front of a doctor, while she lay hooked up to monitors fighting to keep their baby safe. And the doctor was believing him. "Grace," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "have you been feeling anxious? Paranoid?" "I'm not paranoid. I'm not crazy. That necklace belonged to my grandmother, then my mother, then me. It's the only thing I have left of her." David squeezed her hand, his grip just tight enough to hurt. "We'll get through this, honey. I'll find you someone to talk to, a therapist who specializes in postpartum issues." "I'm not postpartum. I haven't even given birth yet." "Prenatal depression, then. Whatever you need." He released her hand and checked his phone. "I have to take this. Emergency at work. Doctor, please do whatever is necessary. Cost is no object." He walked out of the emergency room without kissing her goodbye, without asking if she needed anything, without looking back. Grace lay there, sensors beeping, blood pressure cuffs squeezing her arm every 15 minutes, completely alone. A nurse came in to check her vitals 20 minutes later. She was older, maybe 60, with gentle hands and observant eyes. As she adjusted the monitors, she leaned close. "Honey, Vanessa," the nurse whispered. "I've seen this before. Men who make their wives think they're crazy. It's called gaslighting, and it's abuse." Grace's breath caught. "What?" "Document everything. Keep a record. Dates. Times at what he says. Trust your own memory. You're not crazy." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks. Everyone thinks I am. Everyone at that gala watched him with her, and nobody said anything to me. They all knew. The nurse squeezed her hand. That says everything about them and nothing about you. You focus on keeping yourself and that baby safe. Everything else can wait. After the nurse left, Grace lay in the dim hospital room and thought about the past 6 months. The closed-door phone calls David claimed were business. The late nights he said were investor meetings. The way he'd started sleeping in the guest room because Grace's pregnancy insomnia kept him awake. The coldness when she told him she was pregnant. That flash of anger before he managed to smile. Had he wanted this baby at all? At 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, Grace checked her phone. Instagram loaded and there it was. David's story from an hour ago. Him back at the gala after party, Sophie beside him, both smiling at the camera. The caption read, "Crisis averted, back to celebrating our Q3 victory. Hashtag Team Morrison." Crisis averted. That's what Grace was to him. A crisis, an inconvenience. Something to manage and minimize so he could get back to what actually mattered. Grace deleted Instagram from her phone. Then she opened her contacts and stared at a name she hadn't called in 3 years. Bennett Morrison, her older brother. Grace had cut contact after she married David. Bennett had hated David from the moment they met, said he was using her, said he saw right through the charm. Grace had been furious. She'd accused Bennett of being jealous, of being unable to accept that she was happy. She'd chosen David over her brother. Bennett had been right, but Grace's pride wouldn't let her make that call. Not yet, not when she was this broken. Bennett would swoop in, take control, prove once again that Grace couldn't manage her own life. She could handle this herself. She had to. Grace closed her contacts and lay back against the thin hospital pillow, one hand on her belly, feeling her daughter move beneath her palm. "It's just you and me," she whispered to the baby, "but we're going to be okay. Somehow. I promise." David's penthouse was in Tribeca, all glass and steel and uncomfortable modern furniture. Grace had never liked it, but David said it projected success. Everything in David's life was about projection. The doorman nodded at Grace with what looked like pity. He knew too. Of course he knew. Everyone knew except the fool lying in the hospital bed. The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt eternal. Grace's hip throbbed where she'd hit the floor. Her head ached. The baby pressed against her bladder, constant and demanding. When the elevator doors opened, Grace heard voices, David's and Sophie's, coming from the living room. Maya grabbed Grace's arm. "We should leave." But Grace was already walking down the hallway, drawn by some terrible need to witness her own destruction. They were packing her things, her clothes, her books, her few remaining possessions from before the marriage. Cardboard boxes scattered across the white marble floor. David looked up as Grace entered. No guilt, no shame, just annoyance at being caught. "Grace, you're supposed to be on bed rest." "These are my things. What are you doing?" Sophie stood up from where she'd been kneeling beside a box. She wore jeans and a cashmere sweater, casual and beautiful. The necklace still glittered at her throat. Grace's mother's necklace. "We were going to have them sent to you," Sophie said smoothly. "David filed for divorce this morning. Didn't he tell you?" The words hit like a physical blow. Filed for divorce. This morning. While Grace was in the hospital, David had been with his lawyer. "You can't," Grace whispered. "We're married. I'm pregnant." David's expression was cold. "The papers cite mental instability. The hospital has documentation. Your paranoid accusations, your delusions about jewelry. Dr. Martinez noted it all in your chart. Those weren't delusions. You took my mother's necklace and gave it to your mistress." "See?" David looked at Sophie, at Maya, performing for an audience. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. She's not well. I'm filing for full custody of the baby. Grace is a danger to herself and our child." Grace felt the room spin again, like it had at the gala. "You can't take my baby." "I can, and I will, unless you cooperate with the divorce. Sign the papers, leave quietly, and maybe I'll allow supervised visitation." Sophie moved closer to David, a subtle claiming. "The apartment is in David's LLC. You have 48 hours to remove your belongings and vacate." This is my home. This is David's investment property. You have no legal right to be here. The eviction notice was filed this morning along with the divorce papers. Grace looked around the cold, modern penthouse. Had she ever really lived here? Or had she just been a ghost, haunting rooms that never belonged to her? Something inside Grace snapped. Not broke. Snapped into a new shape. Sharp edges where softness used to be. She lunged at Sophie, going for the necklace. Her mother's necklace. The only thing that mattered. David grabbed her, his hands hard on her shoulders, shoving her backward. You're assaulting my employee. Maya, you're witnessing this. Grace is violent and unstable. Sophie had her phone out recording. I have it all on video. Proof of instability. Grace collapsed to her knees on the marble floor. 7 months pregnant, bruised from the fall, gasping for air. This was her life. This was what she'd chosen. This was how it ended. Maya knelt beside her. Grace, we need to leave now. But Grace couldn't move. She was done. Finished. David was going to take everything. Her home, her baby, her mother's legacy. He was going to erase her completely. Then the door opened. Heavy footsteps, the rustle of expensive fabric. A voice Grace hadn't heard in 3 years, cold and controlled and furious. Grace, get up. We're leaving. Grace looked up through tears. Bennett Morrison stood in the doorway, 6 feet 3 inches tall, tailored charcoal suit, dark hair graying at the temples. Behind him stood 3 people, a lawyer with a briefcase, an assistant with a tablet, and a man who looked like security. Her brother, her overprotective, controlling, insufferable brother, who she'd sworn she'd never speak to again. And in this moment, he looked like salvation. David's face paled. You can't just walk in here. This is my home. Bennett's gaze swept the room, taking in Grace on the floor, Sophie with her phone, the boxes of Grace's belongings. When he spoke, his voice was ice. No, this penthouse is owned by Morrison Holdings, LLC. I bought it in 2019. You've been paying rent to my shell company for 4 years. Grace, as my sister, has more legal right to be here than you do. David's mouth opened, closed. That's not, you can't. Bennett turned to his lawyer. Marcus, call NYPD. Report a domestic disturbance. This man assaulted my pregnant sister. He didn't assault anyone, Sophie said quickly. She attacked me first. I have video. Bennett looked at her for the first time, his gaze moving to the necklace at her throat. Nice necklace. Antique rose-cut diamonds, circa 1940. Belonged to Grace's maternal grandmother, Clara Morrison. I have the insurance appraisal and photographs. That's stolen property. Sophie's hand flew to her throat. Her confident smirk disappeared. Bennett held out his hand to Grace. Get up. Grace took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. She was shaking, crying, but she was standing. You have 1 hour to leave this apartment, Bennett said to David. Anything you leave behind, I'm donating. Your company email, your files, your clothes. 1 hour. You can't throw me out of my own home. It's not your home. It's my property. You're a tenant in default. The rent hasn't been paid in 3 months. Bennett's smile was sharp. Did you think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't keep tabs on the man who married my sister? The assistant behind Bennett handed him a folder. Bennett dropped it on the coffee table. Eviction notice, effective immediately. Fighting it will require lawyers you can't afford. Because your company is 6 months from bankruptcy, David. You're burning through $2 million a month, and your investors are about to find out you've been cooking the books. David's face went from pale to gray. Sophie took a step away from him, survival instinct kicking in. Bennett guided Grace toward the door, his hand firm on her shoulder. To Maya, he said, grab whatever Grace needs. We'll send movers for the rest. As they walked to the elevator, Grace looked back once. David stood frozen in shock. Sophie's fingers touched the necklace nervously, already calculating her exit strategy. The elevator doors closed, and Grace sagged against the wall. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Bennett said quietly. We have a lot of work to do. But Grace, I need you to understand something. You're not alone anymore, and you're never going back to him. For the first time in months, Grace believed things might actually be okay. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually. if she let Bennett help her. Bennett's Tribeca loft was everything David's penthouse wasn't. Warm wood floors, comfortable furniture, walls covered with art. Grace recognized some of the pieces, works she'd curated before she gave up her career. Bennett had bought them all. "You kept them," Grace said softly, touching the frame of a small, abstract painting. "Of course I kept them." "You have excellent taste," Bennett gestured to a guest bedroom. "This is yours for as long as you need it. Security system is active. David doesn't have the code. Neither does anyone else except Maya." Maya was already unpacking the clothes she'd grabbed from the penthouse. "There's a bathroom attached. King-size bed. Grace, this is nicer than my entire apartment." Bennett's assistant, an efficient woman named Jennifer, appeared with herbal tea and pregnancy-safe snacks. "Dr. Martinez sent over your prescriptions. I had them filled. They're on the nightstand with instructions." Grace sank onto the bed. Everything was happening so fast. Yesterday she was married, living in her husband's penthouse, 7 months pregnant and trying to hold her life together. Today she was divorced, homeless, and under her brother's protection. "How did you know?" Grace asked Bennett. "How did you know to come?" "Maya called me from the hospital last night, told me everything." Bennett sat in the chair across from the bed. "I got on the first flight from San Francisco. Got here 2 hours ago." Grace looked at her younger sister. "You called him? After you said you could handle it alone?" Maya's voice was gentle but firm. "Grace, you couldn't. You needed help. Real help. I couldn't give you that, but Bennett could. I don't need to be rescued. I'm not a child." "No," Bennett agreed, "you're not. You're a pregnant woman who's been systematically abused by her husband for years. That's not weakness, Grace. That's survival. But you don't have to just survive anymore. Now you can fight back." A knock on the door. Bennett's lawyer entered, the man called Marcus. Late 50s, sharp eyes, carrying multiple folders. "Grace, this is Marcus Rothman, best divorce attorney in New York. He's going to handle your case." Marcus sat down, opened a folder. "I filed a counter petition this afternoon, contesting David's divorce filing, his custody claims, and his eviction notice. I also filed for a temporary restraining order. David Morrison is prohibited from contacting you or coming within 500 feet of you." "That fast?" "When you have documentation of domestic abuse and a billionaire footing the legal bills, things move quickly." Marcus pulled out papers. "David made several mistakes. First, the apartment actually does belong to your brother's LLC. David has no legal ownership. Second, he filed claiming mental instability, but the hospital records show preeclampsia, not psychiatric issues. Dr. Martinez will testify that your symptoms were physical, stress-induced, not delusional." Grace's head spun. "What about the custody claim?" "We're filing for sole custody with no visitation. New York courts favor mothers, especially when the father has documented infidelity and is under investigation for fraud." "Investigation?" Bennett leaned forward. "I hired a private investigator. Rita Sullivan, former FBI agent. She's been digging into David and Sophie for the past 6 hours. What she found is going to bury them both." The door opened again and a woman in her 40s entered, carrying a laptop. Rita Sullivan had short auburn hair, intelligent gray eyes, and the focused energy of a hunter who'd found her prey. "Grace Morrison," Rita said, setting up her laptop on the desk. "I'm very sorry for what you've been through, but I'm about to make you feel better. Are you ready?" Grace nodded, though she wasn't sure she was ready for anything anymore. Rita opened files on her laptop, turned the screen so Grace could see. Sophie Brennan is not Sophie Brennan. Her real name is Sophie Kellerman, 34 years old, not 28. She's been running this con for 8 years. Photos filled the screen. Sophie with different men, different names, different cities. Chicago, Seattle, Austin, Houston. "Her pattern is consistent," Rita continued. "Target wealthy, married men, get hired at their companies, become indispensable, start an affair, isolate the wife, push for divorce, marry the man, drain his assets, disappear." Grace felt sick. How many times has she done this? At least 8 that I can confirm, probably more. In Chicago, she married a man named James Whitmore while still legally married to someone else in Seattle. That's bigamy. There's an active warrant for her arrest in Illinois. Does David know? That's the interesting part. Rita pulled up emails, bank transfers, corporate documents. David knows exactly who Sophie is. They're partners. He's been embezzling from his investors for 2 years. The company is failing. He's been moving money into offshore accounts, and Sophie's been creating the shell corporations to hide it. Bennett's expression was grim. They're running a classic scheme. Divorce you, claim you're mentally unfit so you can't contest it, move all assets into Sophie's clean identity, get married, flee to the Cayman Islands. The pregnancy complicated things. Grace's hand went to her belly. That's why he was so angry when I told him I was pregnant. Rita pulled up more emails. These are between David and Sophie from 8 months ago, right after you announced the pregnancy. Grace read them, each word a knife in her chest. David, she's pregnant. This ruins everything. Sophie, no it doesn't. Pregnant women are seen as unstable. We use it. David, how? Sophie, make her think she's crazy. Isolate her. By the time she gives birth, she'll be so broken no court will give her custody. You get the baby, she gets nothing. Grace stopped reading. She couldn't breathe. He was going to take my baby, raise her with Sophie, make me think I was too crazy to be a mother. Yes, Rita said quietly. That was the plan. The room went silent. Grace stared at the emails, at the evidence of calculated cruelty that went beyond betrayal into something darker. David hadn't just stopped loving her. He'd never loved her. She'd been a mark from the beginning, a stepping stone to something else. There's more, Rita said. Your mother's necklace? David sold most of your mother's jewelry 8 months ago, got about $400,000 for it, used it to cover company expenses. Sophie got to keep the necklace as a bonus for her participation. Grace felt something inside her shift. The soft, conflict-avoiding woman she'd been was dying. Something harder was taking her place. What do we do? Grace asked. How do we stop them? Bennett smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. We destroy them. Completely. But Grace, this has to be your choice. If we do this, it gets ugly. Public. David and Sophie will fight back. The press will be brutal. Your life becomes a spectacle. Or you can take the quiet divorce, get a settlement, and walk away. Grace looked at the photo of Sophie wearing her mother's necklace, thought about the laugh at the gala, thought about the plan to steal her baby and destroy her sanity. I want to fight, Grace said. I want them to pay for everything. Then that's what we'll do, Bennett said. But we need evidence David can't deny. Evidence that will hold up in court and destroy him in the press. How do we get that? You're going to wear a wire, Rita said. Get David to confess everything. The affair, the embezzlement, the plan to take the baby, all of it. Maya spoke up. Isn't that illegal? Recording someone without consent? Marcus nodded. In New York, yes, it won't be admissible in court. Then what's the point? Grace asked. Bennett's smile widened. Who said anything about court? We're going to leak it to the press, destroy his reputation, his company, his investors. By the time the FBI finishes investigating the fraud, David will be begging to give you everything you want just to make it stop. Grace felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope. Stronger than hope. Power. When do we start? Tomorrow, Rita said. You text David. Tell him you'll sign the divorce papers. You just want to see him one last time. For closure. Grace nodded. She could do this. For her baby. For her mother's memory. For the woman she used to be before David Morrison convinced her she was weak. One question, Grace said. How did you do all this research in 6 hours? Rita and Bennett exchanged a look. I've been investigating David Morrison for 3 years, Rita admitted. Since the day you married him. Bennett hired me to keep tabs, make sure you were safe. We just never had cause to act until now. Grace looked at her brother. You've been watching me this whole time? You're my sister. I wasn't going to let some con artist destroy you without having a backup plan. Bennett's voice was quiet. I'm sorry I couldn't stop you from getting hurt. But I can help you fight back. 3 years, Bennett had been protecting her even when she wouldn't speak to him. even when she'd chosen David over family. Grace stood, walked over to her brother, and hugged him for the first time in 3 years. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me." "Never," Bennett said. "You're a Morrison. We don't give up. We don't break. And we sure as hell don't let people like David Morrison win." Outside the loft windows, Manhattan sparkled with evening lights. Somewhere out there, David and Sophie thought they'd won, thought Grace was broken, defeated, easy to discard. They had no idea what was coming. Grace stood in front of the mirror in Bennett's guest bathroom, studying her reflection. 8 days since the gala. Her bruises had faded from purple to yellow-green. The baby kicked steadily, healthy despite everything. But Grace's eyes looked different, harder, older. Rita attached the small recording device to Grace's bra, running the wire up to a tiny microphone that would be hidden under her collar. It's voice-activated. Battery lasts 6 hours. But remember, this recording won't be admissible in court. "I know," Grace said. "It's for the press, for his investors, for everyone who needs to know what kind of man David Morrison really is." Marcus reviewed the plan one more time. "You meet at the restaurant where David proposed. Public place, crowded, safe. You play the defeated wife. Apologetic, ready to give up. Make him feel powerful. His ego will do the rest." "What if he doesn't confess?" Grace asked. "What if he's smart enough to stay quiet?" Bennett smiled grimly from the doorway. "David Morrison isn't smart. He's arrogant. There's a difference. Get him talking about himself, and he won't be able to stop." Grace's phone buzzed. David's response to her text from this morning. "Fine. 7 tonight. Bella Notte. Don't be dramatic." The restaurant where he'd proposed 6 years ago, down on one knee with a ring he'd probably bought with stolen money. Grace had cried happy tears. She'd thought she was the luckiest woman alive. "I've got someone inside the restaurant," Rita said. "Backup recording in case the wire fails. And Maya will be at a table across the room. You're not alone in this." Grace touched the small bump under her dress where the wire was hidden. "Let's hope I don't have to give birth to win this fight." She was 34 weeks pregnant now. The baby could come any time. Dr. Martinez had cleared her for this one outing, but warned that stress could trigger early labor. "If anything goes wrong," Bennett said, "if David gets aggressive, if you feel unsafe at all, you walk out. Marcus and I will be in a car outside. We can be there in 30 seconds. Grace nodded. She was as ready as she'd ever be. The drive to Bella Notte was quiet. Grace sat in the back of Bennett's town car, hands on her belly, preparing herself mentally. She'd spent the past week studying the evidence Rita compiled. She knew every detail of David's fraud, every date, every shell corporation. She knew about Sophie's previous marriages, her warrants, her pattern. Knowledge was power, and Grace was about to use every bit of it. Bella Notte was exactly as Grace remembered. Intimate Italian restaurant, soft lighting, fresh flowers on every table. She'd been so happy here once. Or she'd thought she was happy. Looking back, she couldn't tell the difference between genuine joy and desperate performance. David was already at the table. He stood when Grace approached, ever the gentleman for the watching staff. "Grace, you look well." "Thank you for meeting me." He held her chair, waited until she was seated before sitting himself. The waiter brought water, took drink orders. David ordered wine. Grace ordered sparkling water. The baby kicked, reminding her why she was here. "So," David said when they were alone, "you wanted closure?" Grace took a breath, channeled every ounce of the conflict-avoiding woman she used to be. "I wanted to apologize for everything, for making a scene at the gala, for the accusations. I know I've been difficult." David's expression shifted, suspicion giving way to satisfaction. "You have been difficult, but I understand. Pregnancy hormones. I just want this to be over peacefully. For the baby's sake. I'll sign whatever papers you want. I just need to know she'll be okay." "She?" David's eyebrows rose. "You're having a girl?" "The ultrasound confirmed it last week. Eleanor. I was thinking of naming her Eleanor." David's smile was genuine for the first time. "Eleanor Morrison, I like it." "I'm glad." Grace played with her water glass. "David, can I ask you something? And will you be honest with me?" Of course. How long have you been sleeping with Sophie? A pause. David calculated how much to admit, how much to deny. But Grace had given him power with her apology, and power made people honest in the worst ways. About 8 months, David said finally, since she started at the company. Did you love her? Sophie understands ambition. She gets what it takes to build something. You just wanted to play house. Grace's chest tightened, but she kept her voice soft. The company is in trouble, isn't it? That's why you've been so stressed. Where did you hear that? I'm not stupid, David. I've been doing this long enough to know when money is tight. The company is failing. David leaned back, studying her. Then he laughed. You're right, the company is burning through cash, has been for 2 years. Investors are idiots. They'll believe anything if you package it right. What are you going to do? What I've been doing, moving assets offshore. Sophie's helping me set up the infrastructure. When the time is right, we'll disappear. Start over somewhere warm. And the baby? Grace asked quietly. Where does Eleanor fit into that plan? David's smile faded. That's the problem, isn't it? I didn't want a baby. Not now, not when everything was about to blow up. But you got pregnant anyway. You could have told me to terminate. Would you have? No. Exactly. So we had to get creative. David leaned forward. Sophie came up with the plan, make you look unstable. Get full custody. Then we take Eleanor and raise her properly. Somewhere you can't find us. Grace's hand went to her belly. You were going to steal my baby. I was going to save my daughter from having a weak, paranoid mother. There's a difference. And my mother's necklace? The jewelry you said was at the jeweler's, David shrugged. Sold most of it. Got $400,000. Company needed capital. Your mother wouldn't have minded. She would have minded. Grace's voice was steel now. She would have destroyed you for this. But she's dead, and you're too weak to do anything about it. The baby kicked hard, like she was protesting on her mother's behalf. Grace smiled, not the soft, apologetic smile she'd been wearing. A sharp, dangerous smile. You're wrong about that, Grace said. David frowned. What? The restaurant door opened. Sophie walked in, scanning the room until she spotted their table. She strode over, confidence radiating from every step. David, I told you not to meet with her. What are you doing? David stood. It's fine, she's signing the papers. She knows she's beaten. Sophie looked at Grace, really looked. Her eyes narrowed. You're wearing a wire. Grace went cold. What? I've done this 12 times, Grace. You think you're the first wife to try this? Sophie pulled a small device from her purse, scanned it over Grace. The device beeped. RF detector. Your wire is broadcasting to a receiver. Where is it? In your purse? She grabbed Grace's bag, dumped it on the table. The small backup recorder Rita had hidden tumbled out. Sophie picked it up, examined it, then dropped it on the floor and crushed it under her heel. Recording someone without consent in New York is a felony. David, call your lawyer. We're pressing charges. David pulled out his phone. This is perfect. Proof she's unstable and criminal. Sophie leaned close to Grace, her voice low and vicious. You're going to lose your baby in prison. And when you get out, I'll be raising Eleanor. I'll make sure she never knows your name. I'll tell her you abandoned her because you were too crazy to be trusted. Grace stared at Sophie Brennan, or Kellerman, or whatever her real name was, at the woman wearing her mother's necklace, at the woman who'd laughed when Grace fell, at the woman who'd planned to steal Grace's child. And Grace laughed, not hysterically, not brokenly, clear, genuine laughter. What's so funny? Sophie demanded. You think that was my only recording? Grace stood, one hand supporting her belly. Did you really think I'd be that stupid? David's hand paused over his phone. What are you talking about? There's a camera in my necklace. Another one in my earring, and my sister Maya is sitting 3 tables away with her phone pointed at us. We have everything. The affair, the embezzlement, the plan to steal my baby. All of it. Sophie's face went white. David looked around the restaurant wildly, finally spotting Maya, who waved. That's still illegal recording, David said. Inadmissible. I don't care about court, Grace said. This isn't for a judge. This is for your investors, for the press, for every single person who needs to know what you really are. She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Sophie, the Chicago Police Department is very interested in talking to you about James Whitmore. Bigamy charges. There's a warrant out for your arrest. They should be here any minute. Right on cue, the restaurant door opened. Two plainclothes detectives walked in, badges visible. Grace left before they could arrest Sophie. She had no desire to watch that part. The satisfaction would come later. Outside, Bennett's car waited. Marcus and Rita sat in back, both wearing headphones, both grinning. We got everything, Rita said. Audio and video. It's gold, Grace. Absolute gold. Grace slid into the car, exhausted and elated. What happens now? Now, Marcus said, we leak it to the right people. Investors first, then the FBI, then the press. By tomorrow morning, David Morrison's reputation will be in ruins. Bennett looked at his sister with something like pride. You did good, Gracie. Really good. Grace leaned back against the leather seat, feeling the baby kick steadily. I need to go home now, rest. This fight isn't over. No, Bennett agreed, but you won this round. That night, safe in Bennett's guest room, Grace watched the dominoes fall on her laptop. The recording went to David's investors at midnight. By 2 in the morning, 3 of them had filed lawsuits. By 4, the board of directors had emergency meetings scheduled. By 6, the FBI had opened an investigation, and David Morrison's world started to crumble, just like he tried to crumble Grace's. The police came for Grace at 7 in the morning, 3 days after the recording. She was eating breakfast in Bennett's kitchen, working through morning sickness that had decided to return with a vengeance at 35 weeks pregnant. Bennett opened the door to find 2 NYPD officers and a detective Grace didn't recognize. Grace Morrison, the detective asked. Yes. You're under arrest for illegal wiretapping and unlawful surveillance. You have the right to remain silent. The world tilted. Bennett stepped between Grace and the officers. You're not arresting my pregnant sister. Show me the warrant. The detective produced papers. Marcus appeared from the study, still in yesterday's clothes. He'd been working around the clock on Grace's case. He scanned the warrant, his expression darkening. David Morrison filed charges, Marcus said quietly. Criminal complaint for recording without consent. Judge Brennan signed the warrant. Judge Brennan, Bennett repeated. Any relation to Sophie Brennan? Her uncle, Marcus confirmed. This is retaliation, and it's coordinated. Grace stood slowly, hands on her belly. The baby was kicking frantically, sensing her mother's panic. What happens now? You're arrested, booked, arraigned. Bail will be set. I'll have you out in a few hours. A few hours? Grace's voice cracked. I can't be in jail for a few hours. I'm 8 months pregnant. They have to process you. There's no way around it. Marcus turned to the detective. I'm her attorney. I'm coming with her. Family member can come too, the detective said, not unkindly. He looked uncomfortable arresting a visibly pregnant woman. Bennett grabbed his jacket. I'm coming. The drive to the precinct was surreal. Grace sat in the back of a police car, hands cuffed in front of her because of the pregnancy, watching Manhattan pass by outside the window. People going about their normal lives. Coffee shops opening. Commuters heading to work. None of them knowing that Grace Morrison's life was imploding. At the precinct, they processed her. Fingerprints. Photos. A humiliating search by a female officer who at least had the decency to look apologetic. Then they put Grace in a holding cell. Bail hearing is in 3 hours, Marcus said through the bars. The prosecutor might argue you're a flight risk because of Bennett's resources. I'll counter that you're heavily pregnant and a first-time offender. You'll be out before lunch. What's the bail going to be? Marcus hesitated. Hard to say. Could be $50,000. Could be more. Bennett spoke from behind him. I don't care if it's $5 million. She's not staying here. They left. Grace was alone in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and despair. 2 other women shared the space. One was asleep on a bench. The other, maybe 25 years old with hollow eyes, watched Grace with a mixture of curiosity and pity. First time? The woman asked. Yes. What did you do? Recorded my husband confessing to fraud and planning to steal my baby. The woman laughed, surprised. Shit, They arrest you for that? In New York, apparently. Your man sounds like a passage work. He is. Was. I don't know what he is anymore. The hours crawled by. Grace's back ached. Her feet swelled. The baby kicked constantly, uncomfortable in the confined space. Around hour 2, Grace felt a sharp pain in her abdomen, different from the usual pregnancy discomfort. Sharper. Urgent. I need a doctor, Grace called out to the guard outside the cell. Bail hearings in 45 minutes. Hold on. I think something's wrong with the baby. The guard looked up from his phone, actually looked at Grace. Her face must have shown real fear because he stood immediately. What kind of wrong? Pain, sharp, it's not normal. He called for medical. 5 minutes later, an EMT arrived, checked Grace's vitals. Blood pressure is spiking, 170 over 110. We need to transport her. She's got a bail hearing in half an hour. I don't care, she's in active preeclampsia. If we don't get her to a hospital, she could seize. The baby could die. The guard unlocked the cell. They put Grace on a stretcher, strapped monitors to her belly. The baby's heartbeat came through loud and fast. Too fast. At the hospital, the same one from the Gala night, Dr. Martinez appeared, took one look at Grace, and her expression went grim. What happened? You were supposed to be on bed rest. I was arrested, Grace said through gritted teeth as another contraction hit. I've been in a holding cell for 2 hours. Jesus Christ, Dr. Martinez turned to the EMT. Who arrests a woman at 35 weeks with documented preeclampsia? NYPD, legal matter. Legal matter is going to kill her and her baby if we don't act fast. Dr. Martinez started giving orders. IV fluids, blood pressure medication, fetal monitoring. Bennett and Marcus burst through the ER doors 20 minutes later. Where is she? Bennett demanded. A nurse directed them to Grace's room. Bennett took one look at his sister, monitors beeping, IV in her arm, tears on her face, and something in his expression turned glacial. Who did this? He asked quietly. David filed charges, Grace whispered. Judge signed the warrant. They arrested me this morning. The bail hearing? Postponed due to medical emergency, Marcus said. It'll be rescheduled. No, Bennett pulled out his phone. It won't. I'm calling the governor. Bennett, you can't. Watch me. He walked out of the room already dialing. Grace lay back against the pillows, feeling her baby move inside her, fighting to stay safe. Marcus, what are my chances? Really? Marcus pulled a chair close. The recording is illegal, that's not in question. But the charges are usually misdemeanors, not felonies. First-time offender, pregnant, victim of domestic abuse. I can probably get the charges reduced or dismissed. But Grace, David filed for emergency custody this morning. He's arguing that your arrest proves you're unfit, that you're a danger to the baby. No, Grace tried to sit up, but the monitors beeped alarmingly. He can't have her. He can't. He won't. I promise you he won't. But we have to be smart about this. Dr. Martinez returned with test results. Your blood pressure is starting to come down with medication. The baby's heartbeat is stabilizing. But Grace, I need to be honest with you. If this happens again, if you have another stress spike like this, I'm doing an emergency C-section. 35 weeks is early, but the baby should be fine. Your life is at risk if we wait. How long do I have to stay? At least 48 hours. Observation. If the blood pressure stays stable, you can go home on modified bed rest. But that means bed, not court appearances, not fighting your ex-husband. Bed. Grace nodded. She didn't have a choice. Bennett returned, his expression slightly less murderous. The governor's chief of staff is looking into the arrest. Apparently, Judge Brennan has a history of questionable rulings. There's already an inquiry pending with the Judicial Conduct Board. This arrest might be the final straw. That doesn't help me now. No, but it's a start. Bennett sat on the edge of the bed. Grace, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it. What? David held a press conference this morning, said you've been stalking him, that you're mentally unstable and dangerous. He showed the video of you lunging at Sophie at the apartment, said he's filing for a restraining order in full custody for the baby's safety. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. He's going to win. He's going to take everything. No, he's not. Bennett's voice was steel. Because Rita found something that changes everything. Marcus nodded. We have proof that Sophie is wanted in Illinois for bigamy and fraud. And we have proof that David knew about her warrants when he hired her. That makes him an accessory. Better than that, Bennett said. We have proof that David's been embezzling from investors for 2 years. The FBI raided his office this morning. They found the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, all of it. David Morrison is going to prison, Grace, for a long time. She felt lighter than she had in years, free, herself. At Bennett's loft, she found her brother asleep on the couch, Eleanor asleep on his chest. The sight made Grace's heart ache in the best way. She gently lifted Eleanor, careful not to wake her. Bennett stirred, opened his eyes. How was dinner? He whispered. Perfect. Thank you for watching her. Anytime, Gracie, I'm proud of you. Really proud. Grace kissed her brother's forehead. I couldn't have survived without you. You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to. At home, the smaller Brooklyn apartment Grace now rented, she put Eleanor in her crib. The nursery was simple. Secondhand furniture, Target curtains, walls decorated with Grace's own amateur watercolors. Nothing expensive, nothing perfect, but it was theirs, really theirs. Grace changed into pajamas, checked her email one last time before bed. There was a message from Marcus. Subject, David Morrison. Custody petition. Grace's heart sank. You helped plan to destroy my life, to take my child. That's not something I can forgive. I know, Sophie said quietly. I don't deserve forgiveness. Grace stood. One question. Did David ever actually love me? Even in the beginning? Sophie looked at her for a long moment. I don't think David Morrison is capable of loving anyone. I'm not sure I am either. But Grace, you are. You love that baby. You love your family. That's something David and I will never have. Grace left the meeting and went straight to Manhattan Trust. With Marcus and the legal documents proving Grace's ownership of Morrison Capital LLC's assets, they accessed the safe deposit box. Inside was her grandmother's engagement ring, plus bonds, cash, and documents showing more hidden assets. Another $200,000 David had been hiding. Grace slipped the sapphire ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. Mom, Grace whispered, I got it back. She opened the email. David filed a petition for parental rights today. Claims he's a reformed man, cites his good behavior in prison, wants supervised visitation starting in 6 months when he's eligible for reduced security. I've already filed a counter motion. Don't worry, he won't get anywhere near Eleanor. But I wanted you to know. Grace closed the laptop. Of course David wouldn't give up. Of course he'd keep fighting. Men like him always did. But Grace was ready. She'd fought him once and won. She could do it again. She checked on Eleanor one more time. Her daughter slept peacefully, thumb in her mouth, her other hand clutching a stuffed elephant Bennett had given her. Your father wants to meet you, Grace whispered, but he doesn't get to. Not because I'm cruel, because I'm protecting you. Because that's what mothers do. Eleanor slept on, safe and loved. Grace went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. That night, Grace sat in the rocking chair with Eleanor, sleeping on her chest, and she made promises. I promise you'll never doubt that you're loved. I promise you'll never feel like you have to be small to make someone else comfortable. I promise you'll grow up knowing your worth isn't determined by what men think of you. Eleanor made small sleeping sounds, content and safe. Your father doesn't get to know you, Grace whispered. Not because I'm keeping you from him out of spite, because he's dangerous. Because he tried to hurt us. Because protecting you is more important than his rights. The weeks that followed were hard in the way new motherhood is always hard. Sleepless nights, endless feedings, the physical recovery from birth. But Grace had help. Bennett, Maya, the doula, the night nurse. She wasn't alone. And slowly Grace began to feel like herself again. Not the woman she'd been before David. Someone new, stronger, more certain. She lay in the dark thinking about David in prison, planning his next move. Thinking about Sophie serving her time. thinking about all the ways the past could reach forward and touch the present. But Grace wasn't the same woman David had married. She wasn't even the same woman who'd collapsed at the gala. She was someone new, someone harder, someone who knew her worth and wouldn't let anyone take it from her again. Tomorrow she'd call Marcus. They'd strategize. They'd fight David's petition and win. Tonight, Grace would sleep because she needed her strength for the battles ahead. And there would always be battles. That was the thing they didn't tell you about surviving. The fight never really ended. It just changed shape. But Grace was ready. She'd always be ready because she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for Eleanor. And for Eleanor, Grace would fight forever. I got your ring back. That night, Grace held Eleanor and told her about her grandmother, about her great-grandmother, about the women who came before them. Strong women, survivors. This ring will be yours someday, Grace said to Eleanor. A reminder that we don't break. We bend, we survive, we come back stronger. Eleanor grabbed at the ring with her tiny fist. Grace smiled, took it off, and put it in the safe. When Eleanor was 18, Grace would give it to her, tell her the whole story, let her know what her mother had survived to keep her safe. For now, it was enough that they were together. Safe. Building a new life from the ashes of the old one. David Morrison's trial began in May, 6 months after Eleanor's birth. Grace didn't attend. She couldn't bear to see him, to sit in a courtroom and watch him perform innocence. But Bennett went every day, taking notes, reporting back. The evidence was overwhelming. 18 months after David's sentencing, Grace stood in a small Soho gallery, adjusting the lighting on a painting of a sunrise. The gallery opening for Resilience Art from Adversity was in 3 hours. Press, donors, art collectors, the culmination of a year's work. Eleanor, now nearly 2 years old, sat on the floor nearby with Maya, playing with blocks. She was a bright, curious child who laughed easily and loved books. She had Grace's eyes and, thankfully, none of David's coldness. This painting, Grace said to her assistant, needs to be the first thing people see when they enter. It sets the tone for everything else. The painting was Grace's mother's work. Clara Morrison had painted it the year before she died, knowing her time was limited. A sunrise over water, golden light breaking through darkness. Hope after despair. Grace had found it in Bennett's storage unit, still wrapped, still waiting. He'll fight it. Let him. He's in federal custody. He has bigger problems than a birth certificate. At 4:17 in the afternoon, after 12 hours of labor, Eleanor Grace Morrison entered the world screaming her tiny lungs out. Dr. Martinez placed her on Grace's chest, this perfect, angry, beautiful baby girl. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, healthy, strong. Grace looked down at her daughter and felt something break open in her chest. Not break, bloom, love so intense it hurt. Purpose so clear it was blinding. Hi, Eleanor, Grace whispered. Hi, baby girl. I'm your mama. I'm right here. I'm never leaving you. Eleanor's cries quieted. She looked up at Grace with dark blue eyes that would probably change color in a few months. She was perfect. Absolutely perfect. Bennett stood beside the bed, looking down at his niece with tears in his eyes. She's beautiful, Grace. Maya took photos, capturing the moment. Grace holding Eleanor, Bennett's hand on Grace's shoulder. When she'd unwrapped it and seen her mother's signature in the corner, Grace had cried for an hour. Now it would be the centerpiece of her first major exhibition as senior curator. Janet walked through, reviewing the setup. It's beautiful, Grace, really beautiful. This is going to be the exhibition of the year. I hope so. I know so. Trust yourself. Trust yourself. Grace was still learning how to do that. Her phone buzzed. A text from Bennett. On my way. Have a surprise for you. Before Grace could respond, Bennett walked in. Behind him stood a woman Grace recognized immediately. Emma Walsh, Grace's college roommate. The woman who'd posted Grace's bail all those months ago and then disappeared back to Chicago. Emma! Grace crossed the gallery, hugged her old friend. What are you doing here? Bennett invited me. Said you'd want me at the opening. Emma smiled. Plus I have news. Remember Sophie Kellerman? Grace tensed. Bank records, emails, testimony from investors, forensic accounting. David had stolen $8 million over 2 years. He'd created shell corporations, falsified records, lied to investors, and Sophie had helped him do it. On the witness stand, Sophie told everything. The affair, the plan to divorce Grace and take Eleanor, the offshore accounts, the scheme to flee to the Cayman Islands. She held nothing back. David's lawyer tried to paint Sophie as the mastermind, David as a victim of her manipulation. But the emails told a different story. This was David's plan. Sophie had just helped execute it. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks later. Grace attended this time. She needed to see it, needed to watch David face consequences. She sat in the back of the courtroom, Bennett beside her, Maya on the other side. Eleanor was with the nanny at Bennett's loft. What about her? Her sentence was reduced again. Good behavior. She's being released next month. Grace felt her stomach drop. Next month? She got 5 years. It's barely been 2. Overcrowding, budget cuts, the system is broken. Emma's expression was apologetic. Grace, I wanted to tell you in person. I know it's not fair. Sophie Kellerman, free, walking the same streets as Grace and Eleanor. Grace's hands started shaking. She can't come near us, Grace said. There's a restraining order. There is, and I'll be monitoring it. But Grace, you need to be prepared. Sophie might try to reach out. She won't. She's smarter than that. But Grace wasn't sure. Sophie was desperate, manipulative, capable of anything. And now she'd be free. Bennett put his hand on Grace's shoulder. We'll handle it if it happens. Right now, focus on tonight. This is your night. Grace nodded. He was right. She couldn't let Sophie Kellerman or the ghost of David Morrison take this from her. 6 weeks after Eleanor's birth, Grace's bail hearing finally happened. She appeared via video conference from the loft, Eleanor sleeping in a bassinet beside her. The judge, a different judge, not Sophie's uncle who'd recused himself from the case, reviewed the evidence, the illegal recording, the extenuating circumstances, David's fraud, Sophie's arrest. Mrs. Morrison, the judge said, what you did was illegal. That's not in question. However, given the circumstance, the domestic abuse, the pregnancy, the defendant's criminal activities, I'm inclined toward leniency. I'm reducing the charges to a misdemeanor, sentencing you to time served, and expunging the record upon completion of 50 hours of community service. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor. One more thing, Mrs. Morrison. I've reviewed the custody petition from David Morrison. Given that he's currently in federal custody and facing significant prison time, I'm dismissing his petition with prejudice. The gallery opening was a success. 200 people came. Press coverage was positive. 3 pieces sold in the first hour. Grace moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations, discussing the art, playing the role of confident curator. Eleanor stayed with Maya in a back room, too young for the chaos. Near the end of the night, as the crowd thinned, a man approached. Tall, maybe 40, kind eyes, expensive but understated suit. He'd been studying Grace's mother's painting for 20 minutes. Ms. Morrison, I'm James Whitmore. This painting is extraordinary. Do you know the artist? Grace's breath caught. James Whitmore, the name Sophie had mentioned. One of her previous marks. She was my mother, Grace said carefully. She died when I was 16. I'm so sorry, James looked back at the painting. The way she captured light breaking through darkness. It's hopeful without being naive. That's rare. You understand art. I collect it, mostly modern impressionists. Grace had pumped before leaving. Her body still divided between mother and survivor. David was brought in wearing a suit, clean-shaven, trying to look respectable. He saw Grace in the back row. Their eyes met for the first time since the disastrous wire dinner. Grace didn't look away, didn't flinch, just held his gaze until he looked down. The prosecutor spoke first, detailed the crimes, the victims, the harm, recommended 15 years federal prison. David's lawyer argued for leniency, first-time offender, respected businessman, family man. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, cut him off. Mr. Morrison is not a family man. He attempted to fraudulently obtain custody of his infant daughter while planning to flee the country. He gaslit his wife into thinking she was mentally unstable. He stole her deceased mother's jewelry. These are not the actions of someone who deserves leniency. She sentenced David Morrison to 12 years in federal prison. He pulled out a business card. I'd love to commission a piece from you if you paint, or discuss acquiring some of your mother's other works if you have them. Grace took the card. James Whitmore, Whitmore Capital, a legitimate business. She'd researched him after Sophie's trial. He'd been one of Sophie's victims in Chicago, lost $500,000 to her scheme. But he'd rebuilt, survived. I don't paint, Grace said, but I do have a few of my mother's pieces in storage. I could send you photos. I'd appreciate that. He paused. Can I ask you something personal? Grace tensed. Depends on the question. Are you the Grace Morrison, the one who was married to David Morrison? Yes. Sophie Kellerman stole from me 3 years ago, $500,000, nearly destroyed my company. When I saw her trial coverage, I recognized her immediately. James looked at Grace with understanding. We're survivors of the same people. That's a strange bond to share. And Sophie? Chicago PD picked her up yesterday. She's in custody, awaiting extradition. Grace closed her eyes, feeling the baby kick inside her. So we won? We're winning, and Marcus corrected. But David's not done fighting. He's desperate now. Desperate men are dangerous. He had no idea how dangerous David would become. 2 days later, Grace was released from the hospital with strict orders for complete bed rest. Bennett hired a private nurse to stay at the loft. Grace spent her days in bed, reading case law, following the news coverage, watching David's world burn. The investors filed a class action lawsuit. The SEC opened an investigation. Federal charges were filed for wire fraud, securities fraud, and money laundering. David's bail was set at $5 million, which he couldn't make because all his assets were frozen. David Morrison was in jail, where he belonged, but Grace's bail hearing still loomed, and David's custody petition was still active. It is, Grace agreed. If you ever want to grab coffee and commiserate about con artists who destroyed our lives, I'd enjoy that. No pressure, just two people who understand what it's like to rebuild from nothing. Grace looked at his card again. A man who'd been through something similar, who understood betrayal, recovery, the slow climb back to normalcy. Maybe, Grace said. Let me think about it. Take your time. The offer stands. After James left, Grace found Maya and Eleanor in the back room. Her daughter was asleep in Maya's arms, exhausted from the excitement. Ready to go home? Maya asked. Yeah, more than ready. They took a car service to Grace's Brooklyn apartment. Grace carried Eleanor upstairs, put her in bed without waking her. Then she collapsed on her own bed, exhausted and exhilarated. Her phone buzzed. A text from James Whitmore. Thank you for a lovely evening. Here's my number if you ever want that coffee. No pressure. Hope to hear from you. Asset forfeiture of everything he'd stolen, plus penalties. Restitution to victims. When he was released, he'd be 50 years old with a felony record and nothing to his name. Mr. Morrison, the judge said before the bailiffs took him away, you destroyed lives in pursuit of money and ego. I hope you use your time in prison to become a better man, because the man you are now deserves exactly what he's getting. David was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He didn't look at Grace again. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Grace had prepared a brief statement with Marcus's help. I'm grateful for the justice system, for the jury, the judge, and everyone who worked to hold David Morrison accountable. I'm grateful to my family for supporting me through the darkest time of my life. And I'm grateful to my daughter Eleanor, who gave me a reason to keep fighting when I wanted to give up. Mrs. Morrison, will you let David see Eleanor? A reporter called out. Grace stared at the message. She could delete it, ignore it, stay safe behind the wall she'd built. Or she could take a small risk, have coffee with someone who understood. See if maybe, possibly, she could trust again. She typed a response. Coffee sounds nice. Next week? His reply came immediately. Next week is perfect. Grace set down her phone, heart racing. This was terrifying, opening herself up to even the possibility of connection. But it was also necessary, because healing meant more than just surviving. It meant living again. The next morning, Grace woke to Eleanor jumping on her bed, all toddler energy and joy. Mama, pancakes. Okay, baby, pancakes. In the kitchen, making breakfast, Eleanor helping by making a mess, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Contentment, not happiness. That would take more time. But contentment, a sense that her life, while not perfect, was hers. Her phone rang. Marcus. Should he wish to establish parental rights in the future, he'll need to file a new petition. But I suspect that by the time he's released, you'll have a very strong case for sole custody. Grace felt tears spill down her cheeks. Thank you, Your Honor. After the hearing ended, Grace picked up Eleanor and held her close. We're safe, baby girl. We're safe. But safety, Grace would learn, was always temporary, always fragile, always one bad decision away from shattering. 3 months after Eleanor's birth, on a cold February morning, Rita called with news. Sophie Kellerman took a plea deal. She's testifying against David. In exchange, she gets 5 years instead of 15. That's it? 5 years? It's how the system works. Cooperating witnesses get deals. But Grace, there's more. Sophie's attorney approached Marcus. She wants to meet with you. Why? She says she has information about David, about things that weren't in the evidence we found. Grace, I have news about David's custody petition. The judge denied it completely, cited his criminal record, the evidence of his plan to take Eleanor, and your documentation of abuse. He ruled that David has no parental rights and can't file again for at least 5 years. Grace felt tears sting her eyes. He can't appeal? He can try, but with his record, he won't win. You're safe, Grace. Eleanor's safe. After hanging up, Grace picked up her daughter and spun her around. You're safe, baby girl. You're mine. Always. Eleanor giggled, not understanding but happy because her mama was happy. That afternoon, Grace went to visit Bennett at his office in Midtown. His tech company, the one he'd sold for billions, had started a new venture. He was busy, successful, but he always made time for Grace. I wanted to thank you, Grace said when they were alone in his office, for everything, for not giving up on me when I cut you out, for being there when I needed help. Grace looked directly at the camera. David Morrison planned to steal my daughter and destroy my sanity to do it. He doesn't get to know Eleanor, not now, not ever. Being a father is a privilege, not a right, and David Morrison has proven he doesn't deserve that privilege. The clip went viral. Some people criticized Grace for keeping a child from her father, but more people, especially women, especially mothers, understood, supported, shared. Grace Morrison became a symbol, not a victim, a survivor, a fighter. 3 months after David's sentencing, Grace's divorce was finalized. The marriage was dissolved. David got nothing. Grace got everything: the settlement from his legitimate assets, her mother's jewelry, custody of Eleanor. Grace Morrison was officially single, officially free. To celebrate, Bennett threw a small party at the loft, just family and close friends. For protecting Eleanor. Bennett smiled. You're my sister. I'd do it all over again in a heartbeat. But Grace, you did the hard part. You fought back. You rebuilt. That was all you. It was us, all of us. I couldn't have done it alone. You're right, and that's the lesson, isn't it? We're not meant to survive alone. We're meant to have people who fight with us. Grace thought about her circle. Bennett, Maya, Marcus, Rita, Emma, Janet. People who'd shown up when she needed them most. And maybe, possibly, James Whitmore could become part of that circle too. Not a savior, not a replacement for what she'd lost. Just another person who understood survival. 1 week later, Grace met James for coffee at a small cafe in Brooklyn. Eleanor was with Bennett, giving Grace a rare afternoon off. James arrived on time, casual clothes, warm smile. They ordered coffee and found a table by the window. So, James said, how do survivors of Sophie Kellerman make small talk? Grace laughed. The three of them, family. What the photos didn't capture was David Morrison's absence. Grace had delivered her baby without the father present, by choice, by necessity, by survival. They stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Grace learned to breastfeed, to change diapers, to understand Eleanor's different cries. Bennett hired a postpartum doula to help at home. Maya stayed in the hospital room, sleeping on the pull-out couch, ready to help with 3 in the morning diaper changes. On the second day, a social worker came to visit. Mrs. Morrison, I need to inform you that David Morrison has filed for a custody evaluation. Family court has ordered a review. Grace had been expecting this. When? You'll receive notice within 30 days. But Mrs. Morrison, I need to be honest with you. The father's rights are substantial in New York. Even with the criminal charges, if he establishes paternity, he has legal standing. He won't establish paternity, Marcus said from the doorway. It felt good to laugh about it. I have no idea. This is new territory for me. For me too. I haven't dated in 3 years. Haven't trusted anyone since Sophie. This isn't a date, Grace said quickly. No, it's coffee. Between two people who understand betrayal. Definitely not a date. His smile was gentle. Unless you want it to be, eventually. No pressure. I have a daughter, I have baggage, I have trust issues that would require professional help to unpack. I have all of that except the daughter, so we're matched. They talked for 2 hours about art, about business, about recovery. James had rebuilt his company from the ground up after Sophie's theft. He'd gone to therapy, learned about red flags, worked on himself. I'm not the same person I was before Sophie, James admitted. I'm more careful, more guarded. But I'm also stronger. I know myself better. I understand that completely. As the afternoon wore on, Grace felt something unexpected. Ease, comfort. The monitors beeped steadily through the night, measuring Grace's too high blood pressure, her racing heartbeat, her body's betrayal. Outside the hospital window, Manhattan glittered with promise and lies. Dr. Martinez released Grace the next morning with strict orders for bed rest and a prescription for blood pressure medication. You need to eliminate stress from your life, Grace. I'm serious. Your baby's life depends on it. Grace nodded numbly. Eliminate stress. Like it was that simple. Like she could just decide not to be married to a man who was destroying her. Maya, Grace's younger sister, picked her up from the hospital. 31 years old, graduate student in journalism, barely making rent in her tiny studio apartment. But she was there. That was more than David had managed. You're staying with me, Maya said as she loaded Grace into her ancient Honda Civic. No arguments. I need to go home. Get some clothes at least. Fine, but I'm coming with you. The beginning of something that might eventually become trust. When they parted, James said, Can we do this again? Maybe next week? Maybe, Graham, Grace said. Let me think about it. But she was already thinking yes. That evening, Grace picked up Eleanor from Bennett's loft. Her daughter ran to her, arms outstretched, shouting, Mama! Did you have fun with Uncle Bennett? We played blocks and read books, and Uncle Bennett made funny faces. Bennett appeared from the kitchen, covered in what looked like spaghetti sauce. She helped me cook, by which I mean she threw pasta at the wall. Grace laughed. Thank you for watching her. Anytime. How was coffee? Good, really good. Are you going to see him again? Maybe. Is that crazy? No, it's brave. You deserve to have a life beyond survival, Gracie. You deserve joy. That night, after Eleanor was asleep, Grace sat in her living room with a glass of wine and thought about the past 2 years, the collapse at the gala. Grace wore a dress that actually fit, heels that didn't hurt, makeup that made her feel beautiful instead of hidden. Maya raised a glass. To my sister, who survived the worst and came out stronger. To Grace, everyone echoed. Grace looked around at the people who'd fought for her. Bennett, who'd never given up even when she pushed him away. Maya, who'd called for help when Grace couldn't. Marcus, who'd protected her legally at every turn. Rita, who'd found the evidence that buried David. Thank you, Grace said quietly, for saving me. We didn't save you, Bennett replied. You saved yourself. We just gave you the tools. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Grace sat in the nursery with Eleanor, 9 months old now, sitting up, babbling, grabbing at everything, growing so fast. Your father is in prison, Grace told her daughter. Someday you'll ask about him. Someday you'll want to know why he's not in your life. And I'll tell you the truth. The hospital, the betrayal, the fight, the victory, the rebuilding. She'd survived, more than survived. She'd transformed. Grace pulled out her journal and wrote, "Things I've learned. 1. You can survive things you thought would destroy you. 2. Asking for help is strength, not weakness. 3. Your worth is not determined by someone else's inability to see it. 4. Starting over isn't failure, it's courage. 5. The life you build after loss can be better than what you lost. 6. You don't have to forgive to move forward. 7. Protecting your child is more important than a father's rights. 8. Healing isn't linear. Some days are harder than others. 9. Trust is earned slowly and lost quickly. That's okay. And 10. You can be both broken and strong. They're not opposites. She closed the journal, finished her wine, checked on Eleanor one last time. Her daughter slept peacefully, thumb in her mouth, safe, loved, protected. Grace looked down at Eleanor, who was playing with her toes in that absorbed way 3-month-old babies do. What kind of information? She wouldn't say, only that it's important, that you need to hear it. Grace thought about it. The last time she'd seen Sophie Brennan, or Kellerman, the woman had been wearing Grace's mother's necklace and threatening to raise Eleanor. Did Grace want to see her again? "Set up the meeting," Grace said, "but Bennett and Marcus come with me." Done. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, at Marcus's law office. Safe, neutral territory. Grace wore her armor, a suit jacket that had finally fit again after losing the pregnancy weight, her mother's earrings, confidence that was only partly performance. Sophie was already there when Grace arrived. She wore an orange jumpsuit, hands cuffed in front of her. The necklace was gone. So was the confidence. Sophie Kellerman looked small, defeated, young. Grace whispered in the dark, "I promise you'll never doubt that you're loved. I promise you'll know your worth. I promise you'll never feel like you have to be small for someone else's comfort. And I promise I'll always fight for you, always." Eleanor stirred, smiled in her sleep. Grace returned to her room, climbed into bed, and for the first time in 3 years, fell asleep without checking the locks 3 times, without reviewing worst-case scenarios, without planning escape routes. She fell asleep simply, peacefully, because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. After darkness, there is always light. Always. You just have to be brave enough to look for it. And Grace Morrison was finally, completely, undeniably brave. 2 years later, Grace Morrison sat in the audience of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, watching her exhibition Resilience, Art from Adversity, receive the award for Exhibition of the Year. Not a softened version, not a lie, the truth. That he was a bad man who made bad choices, that I protected you from him, that you deserved better. Eleanor reached for Grace's face, her tiny hand patting Grace's cheek. Grace kissed her palm. "But tonight, baby girl, we celebrate, because we made it, we survived, and now we get to build something new, something beautiful, something that's just ours." Outside the nursery window, Manhattan sparkled with possibility. The city that had witnessed Grace's destruction was now watching her resurrection. She was 35 years old, single mother, unemployed, starting over from scratch, and she had never felt more powerful. Grace Morrison stood in the loading dock of the Guggenheim Museum, overseeing the delivery of a Kandinsky painting worth $3 million. She wore professional clothes that fit her post-baby body, comfortable shoes, an earpiece connected to the security team. Eleanor, now 4 years old, sat beside her, wearing a fancy dress and swinging her legs. "Mama, when do you go on stage?" Eleanor whispered. "Soon, baby." When Grace's name was called, she stood. The audience applauded. Eleanor clapped loudest of all. At the podium, Grace looked out at the crowd. Bennett, Maya, Marcus, Rita, Janet. Emma had flown in from Chicago, and James Whitmore sat in the 3rd row, their relationship now a 1.5 years old. Cautious but real. "Thank you," Grace began. "This exhibition was personal for me. Art from adversity. Work created by people who survived the worst and turned their pain into beauty. I understood these artists because I am one of them." She told her story. Not all of it, but enough. The gala, the betrayal, the fight, the survival. The audience listened, rapt. "I'm telling you this because someone out there needs to hear it." At the hospital, Dr. Martinez was ready. The delivery room, the nurses, everything prepared. Grace changed into a hospital gown, Let them hook up the monitors. Let them check her dilation. You're at 7 centimeters, Dr. Martinez said. This baby is definitely coming today. How are you feeling about pain management? Epidural, please. Now. The anesthesiologist arrived, administered the epidural. The relief was immediate and profound. Grace could finally breathe. Maya arrived, breathless from running through the hospital. I'm here. Did I miss anything? Just the painful part, Grace said. They labored together, Grace, Maya, and Bennett. Marcus showed up at noon with legal documents for Grace to sign between contractions. Custody papers, divorce papers. Everything they needed to protect the baby the moment she was born. Her birth certificate won't have David's name, Marcus explained. Just you, Eleanor Grace Morrison. Not Morrison David, just Morrison. Someone is sitting in a parked car outside their life, afraid to go inside because they know what they'll find. Someone is being gaslit, isolated, destroyed by someone who claims to love them. Someone is convinced they're weak, crazy, worthless. Grace's voice strengthened. You're not. You're strong enough to survive, strong enough to fight back, strong enough to rebuild, but you don't have to do it alone. Ask for help. Trust the people who show up. And when you make it through, and you will make it through, use your survival to help someone else. The applause was thunderous. Eleanor jumped up and down, shouting, "That's my mama!" After the ceremony, Grace found herself surrounded by women and some men who wanted to share their stories. Survivors of domestic abuse, financial abuse, gaslighting. People who saw themselves in Grace's journey. She listened to each one, gave them Marcus's card, Rita's information, resources for getting help. You survived, Grace told them. Careful with the left corner, Grace directed the art handlers. The frame is original, irreplaceable. 1 year after David's sentencing, 6 months after Grace had returned to work, Janet Friedman, Grace's former boss at the Guggenheim, had called in March. We have a consulting position, part-time, flexible hours, perfect for a new mother with your expertise. Interested? Grace had been interested. Now she was the lead curator for the upcoming exhibition. Resilience, art from adversity, works by artists who'd survived trauma, war, displacement, abuse. It felt personal. It felt right. Eleanor was with Maya today. Grace had pumped before work, left detailed instructions, had her phone volume up in case of emergency. Working motherhood was a constant juggling act, but Grace was getting better at it. Ms. Morrison? An intern approached nervously. The director wants to see you in her office. Grace's stomach dropped. A summons from the director was never casual. Now help someone else survive. That's how we win. Later that night, James took Grace and Eleanor to dinner. Eleanor chattered about school, about her best friend Lucas, about the painting she'd made that was definitely better than Picasso's. James listened with genuine interest, asked questions, made Eleanor giggle. He was good with her, patient, kind. After they put Eleanor to bed at Grace's apartment, James and Grace sat on the couch with wine. I have something to ask you, James said, and you can say no. Please say no if you're not ready. What is it? Move in with me, you and Eleanor. I have a brownstone in Park Slope. Plenty of room. A yard for Eleanor. Close to good schools. He took Grace's hand. I love you. I love Eleanor. I want to build a life with you. Both of you. Grace's heart raced. Living together. Commitment. Trusting someone with not just her life, but her daughter's life. I need to think about it, Grace said. Take all the time you need. Grace, Sophie said when they were all seated, thank you for coming. I didn't come for you. I came for information. I know, Sophie took a breath. I need to tell you something about your mother's jewelry, about what David did with it. Grace's chest tightened. He sold it. I know. Not all of it. He kept one piece. Your grandmother's engagement ring, the one with the sapphire. Grace's grandmother's ring. White gold, antique sapphire, small diamonds. Her mother had worn it every day until she died. Grace had assumed it was in the jewelry David sold. Where is it? Sophie met her eyes. He was going to give it to me, as an engagement ring, after the divorce was final. But I never got it. He hid it, said it was too valuable to keep in the apartment. I think he has a safe deposit box, somewhere you didn't know about. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm trying to make amends. I know that's not enough. I know saying sorry doesn't fix what I did. I'm not going anywhere. Grace thought about it for 2 weeks, listed pros and cons, talked to her therapist, asked Eleanor how she felt about James. I like James, Eleanor said. He reads good stories, and he doesn't get mad when I spill. In the end, Grace said yes. Not because James saved her, she'd saved herself, but because he'd proven over a year and a half that he was safe, trustworthy, real. They moved in on a sunny Saturday in May. Bennett, Maya, Emma, even Marcus helped carry boxes. Eleanor ran through the brownstone, claiming the bedroom with the window seat as hers. That night, after Eleanor was asleep, Grace stood in the backyard of her new home. James came out, handed her a glass of wine. "Happy?" he asked. "Getting there," Grace said honestly. "Some days are harder than others, but yes, I'm happy." "What changed between David and me?" Grace thought about it. "With David, I made myself smaller to fit into his life. Had she done something wrong? Was the position being eliminated?" She headed upstairs, rehearsing explanations, preparing defenses. The old Grace, the one who anticipated disaster. Director Sullivan's office overlooked Fifth Avenue. She was in her 60s, elegant, formidable. Grace had always admired her from a distance. "Grace, sit down." Director Sullivan poured 2 cups of coffee. "I'll get right to the point. We want to offer you a permanent position. Senior Curator of Modern Art. Full benefits. $65,000 a year starting salary." Grace's coffee cup paused halfway to her mouth. "A permanent position? You've done excellent work on the Resilience exhibition. Your organizational skills, your eye for narrative, your ability to work with difficult artists. We want you full-time. I have a daughter. I need flexibility. We'll work with that. Part-time hours with full-time pay until Eleanor's in preschool. Then we renegotiate. Grace, you're talented. With you, you made space for me to be myself. That's the difference." James kissed her forehead. "I never want you to be anything but yourself. That's who I fell in love with." Inside, Eleanor called out, "Mama, I need water." Grace smiled. "Duty calls." "I'll get it," James offered. "You stay here. Enjoy the evening." Grace watched him go inside to get Eleanor water. This was her life now. Shared, complicated, real, not perfect. Nothing was perfect. Grace still had nightmares sometimes. Still checked locks 3 times. Still had days when trust felt impossible. But she had people who understood, who gave her space to heal, who loved her anyway. And that was enough. More than enough. 5 years after the Gala collapse, Grace stood in the same ballroom where she'd fallen. The Metropolitan Arts Gala had invited her as a guest speaker. Full circle. He'd been present for every important conversation, protecting Grace legally at every turn. David Morrison is currently incarcerated on federal charges. He has no access to the child for DNA testing. By the time he's released, if he's released, Eleanor will be old enough that forced paternity testing becomes complicated. The social worker looked uncomfortable. "That's not how this usually works." "Nothing about this case is usual," Marcus replied. After the social worker left, Grace held Eleanor close. "He's never going to stop, is he? Even from prison, he's going to keep fighting." "Then we keep fighting back," Bennett said, "for as long as it takes." They brought Eleanor home to the loft on a cold November afternoon. The nursery Bennett had set up was perfect. Soft yellow walls, a sturdy crib, a rocking chair by the window. Grace's mother's paintings on the walls. Family surrounding this new life. Grace wore a red dress, her mother's necklace, returned from evidence after Sophie's trial, in confidence she'd earned through survival. She took the stage and told her story, all of it. The collapse, the laugh, the betrayal, the fight, the victory. When she finished, the ballroom erupted in applause. A standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Backstage, Bennett hugged her. "I'm so proud of you, Gracie. I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." That night, Grace went home to the brownstone she now shared with James and Eleanor. Her daughter, 9 years old now, was practicing piano in the living room. James was cooking dinner in the kitchen. Normal. Beautifully, wonderfully normal. Grace helped Eleanor with her piano practice, then joined James in the kitchen. "How did it go?" he asked. "Good, really good." "I'm glad." They ate dinner as a family, talked about school, work, weekend plans. "We don't want to lose you." Grace thought about the past 2 years, the destruction, the rebuilding, the slow, painful growth into someone new. "Yes," Grace said, "I accept." She called Bennett from the museum steps, giddy with good news. "I got a permanent position, senior curator." "Congratulations, Gracie, you earned it." "I need to celebrate. Can you watch Eleanor tonight? I want to take Maya to dinner." "Of course. Bring her by whenever." That evening, Grace dropped Eleanor at Bennett's loft. Her daughter was walking now into everything, a tiny tornado of energy. Bennett scooped her up, tossed her in the air, made her shriek with laughter. "Your mama is celebrating," Bennett told Eleanor, "because she's amazing." Grace kissed her daughter's head. "Be good for Uncle Bennett. Mama will be back before bedtime." She met Maya at a wine bar in the West Village. They ordered good wine, cheese, olives, celebrated like they used to before David, before everything fell apart. Eleanor told jokes she'd learned from her friend Zoe. James laughed at all of them. After dinner, Eleanor pulled Grace aside. "Mama, I have a question." "What is it, sweetheart?" "My teacher asked about my family tree. For school, do I put my father on it?" Grace's heart clenched. They'd talked about David in age-appropriate ways over the years. Eleanor knew she had a father who'd made bad choices, who wasn't safe to know. But this was the first time Eleanor had to decide how to publicly acknowledge him. "That's your choice," Grace said carefully. "You can put him on it if you want, or not. There's no wrong answer." "What would you do?" "I would leave him off, because he's not part of our family. He's biologically related to you, but family is more than biology. Family is the people who show up, who love you, who protect you." Eleanor nodded, thinking. "So Uncle Bennett is family, and Aunt Maya and James." "Yes, they are." "Then I'll put them on my tree instead. But I can give you this. The box is at Manhattan Trust, under the name of one of David's shell corporations. Morrison Capital, LLC. I have the account number." She slid a piece of paper across the table. Grace looked at it, then at Sophie. "Why?" "Why?" Grace asked. "Why help me now?" "Because I saw the photos of Eleanor. Your lawyer showed me during the deposition. She's beautiful. And I realized what I almost did, what I helped David plan. I was going to help him steal your baby, Grace. I was going to raise her as mine and make you think you were too crazy to be a mother." Sophie's voice broke. "I've done a lot of terrible things, but that's the worst, and I can't fix it. But I can give you this. Your grandmother's ring. For Eleanor. For when she's older." Grace took the paper, folded it carefully. "Thank you. I'm sorry for all of it. For laughing when you fell. For wearing your mother's necklace. For everything." "I know," Grace said, "but sorry doesn't undo it." Grace hugged her daughter close. "That sounds perfect, baby." That night, after Eleanor was asleep, Grace stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, watching her breathe. 9 years old. Smart, funny, kind. Everything Grace had hoped she'd be. David Morrison had never met his daughter. Never would if Grace had anything to say about it. He tried twice more for visitation rights. Both times denied. Sophie Kellerman had served her time, gotten out, and disappeared. Grace never heard from her again. Grace's life had moved on, built something new from the ashes of the old. She closed Eleanor's door quietly, went to her own bedroom. James was already in bed, reading. "She okay?" he asked. "She's perfect." Grace climbed into bed, turned off the light, settled against James's shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For being safe, for giving me time to trust you, for loving Eleanor, for all of it." "You don't have to thank me for that. It's just love." "To new beginnings," Maya said, raising her glass. "To surviving and thriving," Grace replied. They talked about the future. Maya was finishing her graduate degree, had a journalism fellowship lined up. Grace's career was back on track. Eleanor was healthy, happy, growing. Do you ever think about dating? Maya asked carefully. It's been over a year. Grace had thought about it. Sometimes she caught herself noticing attractive men. Sometimes she imagined what it would be like to trust someone again. But the thought of letting someone close, of being vulnerable, still felt impossible. Not yet, Grace said. Maybe someday. But right now, I'm good. I have Eleanor. I have my family. I have my work. That's enough. You deserve love, Grace. Real love, not what David gave you. I know, but I'm not ready. Maybe I never will be. And that's okay too. After dinner, Grace walked home through Greenwich Village. Spring evening, warm air, city sounds. That's what it looks like. Grace closed her eyes. James was right. This was what love looked like. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts or romantic drama, just consistency, safety, showing up, being there, real love. The kind Grace deserved all along but hadn't known to look for. Outside, the city hummed with life. Inside, Grace Morrison, survivor, fighter, mother, curator, partner, finally, completely fell asleep. No more nightmares, no more fear, no more checking locks, just peace. She'd earned it, every single moment of it. The fight wasn't over. 1 week after her arrest, Grace's water broke. At 36 weeks, 2 days, Grace went into labor, and everything changed again. The contractions started at 4 in the morning. Grace woke to pain radiating across her belly, different from the preeclampsia pain. This was purposeful, her body preparing to bring her daughter into the world. "Bennett," Grace called out. Her voice sounded small in the big loft. He was there in 30 seconds, fully awake. "What's wrong?" "The baby's coming. My water broke." Bennett moved fast, called the car service, called Dr. Martinez, called Maya. Within 20 minutes, Grace was in the car heading to the hospital, timing contractions that were already 3 minutes apart. "It's too fast," Grace gasped as another contraction hit. "First babies aren't supposed to come this fast." "Your baby wants to meet you," Bennett said. He held her hand, let her squeeze through the pain. "She's been waiting long enough."